dimly lit fast food restaurant stands alone in a deserted parking lot under the pale glow of a flickering streetlight. The restaurant's neon sign buzzes faintly, casting an eerie red glow over the empty parking spaces. The surrounding streets are dark, with the faint silhouette of trees swaying in the night wind. The atmosphere feels heavy, as if something terrible is about to happen. About an hour in, a man came up to the drive-through window. He ordered in a slurred voice, and I could tell he wasn't entirely sober. Since I was working alone, I asked him to pull into the lot so I could bring his food out. As I stepped out into the parking lot, the night felt thicker, heavier than usual. It was late, past midnight, and the area around Rally's was utterly silent, the kind of silence that makes every tiny sound seem amplified. I clutched the fast food bag tightly, my eyes scanning the deserted lot. His car sat under a single, dim streetlight, which flickered sporadically, casting strange, jittery shadows around his vehicle. I walked toward him, trying to appear calm and professional, but something felt off. The air itself felt wrong, charged with a tension I couldn't quite explain. As I approached his car, I noticed the man watching me, his eyes barely visible in the dark interior. They caught the faint glow of the streetlight, glinting in a way that made my skin crawl. His face was obscured in shadow, but I could see enough to make out his unkempt hair and the strange set of his jaw, slightly clenched, as if he were holding something back. I reached his car window and tapped on it lightly, hoping he'd just take his food and leave without any trouble. He rolled the window down slowly, and the smell of alcohol hit me like a wall. It was strong, sour, and unmistakable. For a brief moment, he just stared at me, his eyes glassy and unfocused, yet intense. I forced a polite smile and handed him the bag, trying not to meet his gaze for too long. "Here you go, sir," I said, keeping my tone light and steady. He reached out, his movements sluggish but forceful, and took the bag from my hand, his fingers brushing mine just slightly. His touch was cold, clammy, and lingering. I stepped back instinctively, giving him space, already feeling my heart rate pick up, but instead of just leaving, he opened the bag, rummaging through it. He glanced up at me and then back down, as if searching for something. "Working alone, huh?" he slurred, his words slightly garbled but clear enough to feel unsettling. I nodded slightly, keeping my response brief. "Yeah, it's just me tonight." He looked up at me again, his gaze lingering too long, and I felt the weight of his stare settle over me, thick and uncomfortable. He let out a laugh, low, slow, and humorless. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to keep things brief, muttering, "Well, I better get back to it," and taking a step back. But as I moved, he leaned out of the window slightly, his gaze darkening, his mouth curving into a strange, almost taunting smile. "Sure you don't want to stay and chat?" he asked, the words dripping with something I couldn't quite place, something that felt both mocking and threatening. I shook my head quickly, giving a small, forced laugh, then turned and headed back toward the restaurant as quickly as I could without outright running. As I reached the door, I couldn't resist glancing back. He was still there, leaning halfway out of his window, watching me with a look that lingered far too long, a look that hinted he wasn't done with me yet. Had barely settled back inside when I heard it. At first, it was just muffled yelling, echoing faintly through the glass. I thought maybe he'd just drive off, muttering under his breath, "Another unsatisfied customer." But the shouting grew louder, angrier, carrying words I could barely make out, something about his order being wrong. The sound cut through the quiet of the empty restaurant, each word sharper, more vicious than the last. I took a deep breath, glancing nervously toward the drive-through window. There he was, just a few feet away on the other side of the glass, his face twisted with anger. He looked different now, more animated, his glassy eyes blazing with fury. He pounded on the window with a force that rattled the glass, his fist slamming into it over and over. The sound was jarring, harsh, filling the small space with an intense, grating echo that made my skin prickle. I stepped closer, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to sound calm. "Sir, I'm sorry about the mix-up. Let me fix your order," I offered, raising my hand slightly, trying to convey that I meant no harm. I wanted to defuse the situation, to make him go away, but as I spoke, his face twisted even further, a vein pulsing on his forehead. He leaned closer to the window, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as he muttered something under his breath, words dripping with menace. The scent of alcohol seeped through the small gap around the drive-through window, a sour, heavy smell that mingled with the smell of fryer oil and stale air. His words were slurred, tangled together in a drunken mess, but I could still make out fragments: disrespectful, never coming back, you don't know who you're dealing with. Each sentence came with a fresh slam of his fists against the glass, his hand smacking down harder and harder, as if he were testing the limits, seeing how far he could push. I took a small step back, heart hammering in my chest. My hands started to shake, the fear inching up my spine as I realized this wasn't just a customer complaint, this was something far more unpredictable, something raw and ugly that could explode at any second. I took a deep breath and warned him, my voice trembling despite my best efforts, if you don't leave, I'll have to call the police. My words seemed to hit a nerve, igniting something dark inside him. His eyes widened and he snarled, a deep, animalistic sound that sent a chill through me. In an instant, his hand shot out toward the window, fingers grasping, trying to grab me through the small opening. I jumped back, heart pounding wildly, barely evading his reach. The window rattled as he clawed at it, his fingers scraping against the glass with a desperate fury. My stomach twisted as I fumbled for my phone, my mind blank with terror. But the second he saw me reach for it, his rage escalated, transforming from seething anger to violent madness. Suddenly, he spun around and stormed to the side door, his footsteps heavy and unsteady. I heard him slam into the metal, his fists and feet beating against it as he screamed, demanding that I come out and face him so he could kick my ass. Each impact against the door jolted me, echoing through the empty restaurant, a constant reminder of just how thin the barrier was between us. In that moment, I knew I was trapped, completely alone, and at the mercy of a man unhinged. I felt paralyzed, my mind racing but my body frozen as the man's fists pounded relentlessly against the side door. Each impact echoed through the empty restaurant, like thunder crashing against a flimsy wall. I knew that door was locked, but in that moment, it didn't feel like enough. The metal barrier suddenly seemed thin, fragile, too weak to keep out the fury on the other side. Come on, he bellowed, his voice hoarse and raw with rage. Get out here and face me. His words slurred together, each syllable dripping with aggression. I could hear him kicking at the door now, the brutal thud of his boot slamming into it over and over. The door rattled violently with each strike, the metal groaning under the pressure, and I couldn't help but imagine it giving way, him stumbling in, wild-eyed and furious, ready to tear me apart. I stumbled backward, putting as much distance between myself and that door as I could, my legs shaking as I moved. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the kitchen, looking for some place to hide, some escape route that didn't exist. The restaurant felt like a cage, and I was trapped inside it, with nowhere to go and nowhere to hide. Clutching my phone tightly, I fumbled to dial 911, my fingers slipping over the screen in my panic. Every second felt like an eternity, my heartbeat pounding louder than his fists, louder than his muffled curses and shouts. When the dispatcher's calm voice finally came on the line, I could barely speak, my voice a whisper, shaky and hoarse. Please, you have to help me. There's a man outside, he's trying to break in. The dispatcher's voice was steady, reassuring, but her words sounded distant, drowned out by the sound of the man's fist slamming against the door. Officers are on their way, she said, but it didn't feel real, didn't feel close enough. The minutes stretched out, and each second felt like it lasted a lifetime. As I waited, the man's rage only intensified. I could hear him growling, muttering threats to himself, his voice thick with hatred and frustration. You think you can just ignore me? He shouted, the words slurring together in a drunken mess. You're gonna pay for that, you little. He didn't finish the sentence, but the threat lingered, thick and poisonous, hanging in the air like smoke. I pressed myself against the far wall, trying to disappear into the shadows, wishing I could melt into the cold tiles beneath my feet. My whole body trembled, and a cold sweat trickled down my back as I fought to keep my breathing quiet, to keep him from hearing the fear that consumed me. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. Silence filled the room, oppressive and thick. I held my breath, listening, every nerve on edge. Had he left? Was it over? But then I heard it, the slow, scraping sound of his fingers running down the metal door, a horrible, deliberate noise, as if he was letting me know he was still there, as if he was savoring my terror. Come on, he muttered, his voice softer now, almost coaxing, like he was speaking to a frightened animal. Come on out, it'll be easier if you just come out. The calmness in his voice was worse than the shouting, worse than the pounding. It was the sound of someone who wasn't going to give up, who would wait as long as it took. I pressed my hand over my mouth, stifling a sob, desperate to keep quiet, praying that the sirens would arrive before he found a way in. The silence stretched on, and in that moment, I'd never felt more alone, more vulnerable, as if the whole world had forgotten I existed, leaving me stranded, face to face with someone I couldn't escape. Just when I thought I couldn't bear the silence any longer, I heard the faint sound of sirens cutting through the night. At first, I didn't believe it. The noise felt distant, almost unreal, like a trick my mind was playing to give me hope. But as the wail grew louder, closer, I knew it was real. Relief washed over me, but I didn't dare move. I stayed pressed against the wall, listening, my breath shallow, waiting for the nightmare to end. Then, the intruder's voice dropped to a mutter, and his fist stopped pounding. I dared a glance toward the door, just in time to see the red and blue lights flash across the parking lot, illuminating his figure in harsh, strobing bursts. He stumbled away from the door, his face twisted in frustration, his drunken anger fading into something else, panic. He looked around wildly, as if deciding whether to fight or flee. Seconds later, I saw 2 police officers step out of their car, their hands on their belts, assessing the situation with careful eyes. "Sir, step away from the building," one of them commanded, his voice firm and unyielding. For a moment, the man hesitated, his eyes flicking between the officers and the door. But then, with a defeated sigh, he raised his hands, stumbling as they moved in to restrain him. I stayed hidden, barely breathing as they led him away, his shouts now muffled and distant. Only then did I allow myself to exhale, feeling the tension slowly drain from my body. The ordeal was finally over, but I knew, deep down, that I'd never feel safe on a night shift again. The man was gone, handcuffed and escorted away, but the echoes of that night stayed with me long after the police car pulled out of the lot. Inside the restaurant, everything felt eerily still, almost too quiet, as if the place itself was holding its breath. I stood there, feeling the emptiness pressing in on me, my mind replaying the night's events over and over, each moment sharper, more vivid than before. I glanced around the kitchen, the counters, the fryer, the register, everything looked just as it always did, but something had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed some invisible line. I'd always known that working the night shift came with risks, but I'd never expected to feel so utterly vulnerable, so completely alone. The fear lingered in my chest, a tightness that refused to fade. Every little sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock made me flinch. Shadows seemed darker, edges sharper. The comfort of routine was gone, replaced by the gnawing realization that a single person could turn a quiet night into a nightmare. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease, but I knew it wouldn't be that easy. When the police had asked me if I was okay, I'd nodded, forced a smile, even joked about it. But deep down, I knew the truth, I didn't want to work nights again. Not here, not alone. That night had left a mark invisible to others but etched deeply into my mind. And though I'd never see that man again, a part of me felt like he was still out there, lurking in the shadows, just waiting for a chance to return. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of that night remained sharp, like a scar that refused to fade. Every detail was still vivid, the man's crazed eyes, the way his fists had pounded against the door, the crackling sound of his voice as he'd demanded to be let in. I tried to shake it off, to bury the memory deep, but it lingered, resurfacing in the quiet moments, haunting me like a shadow that wouldn't let go. When my manager offered me a spot on the day shift, I accepted without hesitation. Working in the sunlight, surrounded by other people, felt like a lifeline. During the day, the restaurant felt different, warmer, safer, filled with the comforting bustle of customers and co-workers. But even in the daylight, there were moments when I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see his figure lurking by the door, watching, waiting. Sometimes, after closing, I'd walk out to my car and feel my heart pick up as I glanced across the empty lot, looking for signs of movement, searching the shadows for his face. I knew it was irrational, knew he'd been dealt with, but the fear was still there, alive and raw, reminding me that danger could appear out of nowhere, transforming the familiar into something dark and terrifying. That night at Rally's had changed me in ways I hadn't expected. I wasn't the same person who'd first taken on those night shifts, confident and unafraid. Now, I was someone else, someone more cautious, more guarded, someone who'd learned firsthand that even the smallest, most mundane job could suddenly become a fight for survival. Even months after that night, I still felt its presence lingering like an unseen weight. The memory had settled deep, embedding itself into my daily life in subtle, unsettling ways. I found myself avoiding any situation that might leave me alone, especially at night. The idea of facing another stranger in a quiet, isolated setting filled me with a deep-rooted anxiety I couldn't shake. But as time passed, I began to realize that it wasn't just the fear of what could happen that stuck with me, it was also a hard, unwelcome lesson in vulnerability. For the first time in my life, I'd come face to face with the fragility of safety, the unsettling truth that even the most routine jobs could twist into something dark, something life-altering in a single instant. Now, each time I'd walk into a restaurant, store, or any other place where workers stood alone at night, I'd feel a pang of empathy I hadn't known before. I knew what it was like to look into the eyes of someone with no intentions but harm, to feel the silent, oppressive weight of being completely and utterly alone with danger. In a way, I felt grateful for the shift, not for the terror, but for the reminder to stay aware, to stay vigilant. It had reshaped me, made me more cautious, more appreciative of the safety I'd always taken for granted. I learned to pay attention to my surroundings, to listen to that inner voice that warned me of danger. And most importantly, I learned to value those moments of peace, understanding how quickly they could vanish. That night at Rally's may have been just one shift, but the echoes of it would stay with me, shaping me and reminding me sometimes survival isn't just a matter of luck. It's about staying prepared, staying alert, and never forgetting how quickly everything can change.